So, what if I told you that a financial crash from way back in the 1870s, a crash sparked by events happening over in Vienna and Berlin, actually has a ton in common with the 2008 crisis? Yep, you heard that right. This wasn't just some forgotten blip on the economic radar. This was a crash that not only tanked the economy, it helped end one of the most important chapters in American history, Reconstruction, and totally changed the country's direction. It's this wild story of greed, fear, and just how connected the world really was even back then. And you know what? It sounds shockingly modern. So let's dive in and break down exactly how it all went down.
Okay, check this out. See this map? This was basically the internet of the 1870s. Seriously. It was this incredible web of iron and steam crisscrossing the country, connecting markets, creating unbelievable fortunes. I mean, it was driving this absolutely massive economic boom right after the Civil War. And everyone wanted a piece of the action. But, just like any superheated tech bubble we see today, the whole thing was built on a really, really shaky foundation. All right, so this brings us to what we now call the Great Railroad Bubble. And it was all happening during an era that Mark Twain famously dubbed the Gilded Age. And that name is just perfect, because on the surface, everything looked golden, right? It was shiny and new, you had massive industrial growth, cities were just exploding in size, and there was this feeling of just unlimited possibility. The Civil War was finally over, and it felt like the nation was being reborn, forged in steel.
I mean, the sheer scale of this boom is it's hard to wrap your head around. Get this, 35,000 miles of new railroad track were laid in just 8 years. 8! To put that into perspective for you, the railroad industry became the single largest employer in the entire country outside of agriculture. It was the absolute engine of the American economy, and it was dragging everything else forward with it.
So you have to be asking, right, where did all the money for this come from? Because it wasn't coming from profits. I mean, a lot of these railroads were literally just lines drawn on a map. They didn't exist yet. The whole thing was built on what's called speculative capital. And that's just a fancy way of saying it was all a massive gamble. People were borrowing insane amounts of money, betting that these railroads would, one day be profitable. And a huge chunk of this cash, it was flooding in from European investors who were totally caught up in the frenzy too.
And that right there, that dependence on foreign money, that was the big, critical weakness in the whole system. Because while America was living it up in this massive boom, the first tremors of the earthquake were already starting to rumble across the Atlantic over in Europe.
Okay, so you really got to follow the dominoes here, because a series of events that seem totally disconnected start this massive chain reaction. First, the Franco-Prussian War ends in '71. The winner, Germany, demands a boatload of gold from France as payment. Then, what does Germany do with all that gold? They switch their entire currency to the gold standard. Now, that was a huge deal. It meant they started selling off tons and tons of silver, which made the value of silver just plummet, and it totally destabilized global markets. All this financial shuffling and nervousness builds and builds until, bang! May 1873, the Vienna Stock Exchange completely collapses. And just like that, European investors get spooked. They need cash, fast. And where do they go to get it? They start pulling their money out of those risky American railroad bonds.
And this chart, wow, it just perfectly shows the stress in the system. Now, don't worry, you don't need to be an economist to get this. Just look. This shows how much it costs to borrow money overnight in Austria-Hungary. And would you just look at those insane spikes? That tells you that money is getting incredibly tight, it's getting super expensive to borrow, and pure panic is starting to set in. The financial plumbing of Europe was basically grinding to a halt.
So, that panic brewing in Europe, it's about to hop on a steamship and cross the Atlantic with a vengeance. And it all comes to a head with a shocking collapse of one of America's most powerful and supposedly untouchable banks.
Let me introduce you to Jay Cooke and Company. Now, this was not just any bank. These guys were considered national heroes. I mean, they had practically single-handedly financed the entire Union Army during the Civil War. People saw them as completely unshakable, rock solid. But they had made a massive, all-in bet on one single project, the brand new Northern Pacific Railway.
And this is the moment the whole floor just gives out. The European investors are selling, not buying. Cooke can't raise another dollar to keep building the railroad. So, on September 18th, 1873, the unthinkable happens. The hero of the Civil War, the biggest bank in the United States, they announce they're out of cash. They're suspending payments. They failed.
You can only imagine the reaction on Wall Street. It was just immediate shock followed by pure pandemonium. The New York Times wrote about it the very next day, and I love this quote. "The brokers stood perfectly thunderstruck for a moment, and then there was a general run. It was a complete and total meltdown. All of the trust that holds a financial system together, it just, poof, evaporated in an instant."
And the dominoes started to fall, and they fell fast. First up, the railroads themselves. 89 major railroad companies went bankrupt. Think about that. The very industry that was supposed to be building the future of America was now the epicenter of its collapse.
And of course, it didn't stop with the railroads, not even close. This chart here shows what happened to the banks. You don't even have to read the labels. Just look at that huge spike in closures right there in 1873. The collapse of Jay Cooke triggered a classic bank run. Everyone rushed to pull their money out of their own bank, terrified it would be next. And one by one, hundreds of other banks just went under. The financial virus was spreading across the whole country.
Now, this wasn't just some quick recession that blew over in a year. No, the Panic of 1873 kicked off something much, much worse. It's what historians now call the Long Depression, and its effects were felt for years and years, and they ended up transforming American society in some really profound ways.
So, what did this actually mean for regular people? Well, for starters, a brutal 65-month long depression. To this day, the longest in American history. Unemployment skyrocketed to 14% across the country, and in places like New York City, it hit a staggering 1 in 4 people, 25%. A whole new social phenomenon emerged, these armies of unemployed men, many of them guys who had just fought in the Civil War. They were called tramps, and they just wandered the country desperate for work. And all that desperation eventually boiled over into incredible violence, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which became one of the bloodiest labor conflicts the nation had ever witnessed.
But the impact wasn't just economic. This disaster completely reshaped American politics. See, for years after the Civil War, the nation's focus had been on Reconstruction in the South. But now, the country's attention and its money were pulled away. People in the North were facing unemployment and chaos in their own cities. They lost the political will to keep funding the very expensive, very difficult project of Reconstruction. You could say the Panic of 1873 gave politicians the perfect excuse they needed to abandon the mission, which led directly to federal troops being pulled out of the South in 1877 and the end of that entire era.
Okay, but even as all this political stuff was happening, the financial system itself was desperately trying to save itself from completely imploding. And right in the middle of all the chaos, a pretty fascinating innovation pops up. Remember, this is before the Federal Reserve existed, so there was no central bank to step in. So the private banks in New York came up with something called clearinghouse loan certificates. Basically, it was a form of emergency credit, like a special IOU that banks could use just with each other. It was a clever way to keep the system running, to settle accounts, without having to use actual cash, which was suddenly incredibly rare.
So after all that, why are we talking about this? Why does a 150-year-old story matter today? Well, because digging through the wreckage of 1873 leaves us with some absolutely timeless lessons about how finance, and frankly, how the world really works.
All right, lesson number 1. Global contagion is real, and it is terrifying. A stock market crash in Vienna can absolutely bankrupt a bank in Philadelphia and get a factory worker in Chicago laid off. We are all connected. Lesson 2. Financial innovation. Well, it cuts both ways. Those complex railroad bonds were kind of like the mortgage-backed securities of their day. They were new, they were exciting, and pretty much nobody understood them. They fueled the boom on the way up, and they made the bust so much worse on the way down. Lesson 3. Liquidity is everything, or as they say, cash is king. It doesn't matter how great your business looks on paper. If you can't get your hands on cash to pay your bills today, you are done. That's what took down Jay Cooke, and it's exactly what took down Lehman Brothers in 2008. And finally, number 4, the aftershocks of a crisis change everything. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They have deep, lasting social and political consequences that can completely reshape a nation.
So I'll leave you with this question. Think about it for a second. A totally globalized economy, a massive boom fueled by some hot new technology, risky, complex financial tools that almost nobody really understands, and then a sudden, incredibly painful crash that has devastating consequences for all of society. Tell me, why does a crisis from 150 years ago feel so unsettlingly familiar?